Welcome to Continuing Education Module, Fundamentals of Sick Leave Absenteeism, some insights for wellness professionals. The agenda for this particular module includes some basic definitions in the history of sick leave absenteeism, general patterns of sick leave absenteeism that are usually encountered by employers, targeting sick leave with programming, suggestions for measurement, and a summary of key points. Our key definition for sick leave absenteeism is follows: the state of being absent, especially frequently, unplanned or unscheduled absence due to personal health reasons. And it's also the practice of an absentee. So these are all aspects of our definitional base of sick leave absenteeism. The history of sick leave absenteeism has the following major elements in it. First of all, the origins of sick leave in the early work environment in the U.S. was essentially no work, no pay. So basically we didn't have sick leave benefits until the early 20s, when we started to build sick leave benefits into union contracts during the 20s and 30s. Sick leave absenteeism coverage was added slowly after World War II, with a concern for the effects on productivity, but also the balance in terms of the well-being of employees. There was significant experimentation about how to structure sick leave since that time, and many efforts have been undertaken to try and prevent abuse of sick leave, particularly in situations where people feel entitled to their sick leave and have a use or lose provision, and then choose to essentially use their sick leave up at the end of a year period or the end of a calendar year. It has become a safety valve for life stress. So our sick leave usage is looked upon in a social norm sense as a safety valve for intense life stress. In the 2000s and beyond, we essentially are moving away from designated sick leave to paid time off kinds of bank approaches, where we're looking at bringing together the different kinds of leave, and we'll talk more about that as we go on, and then being able to have that leave used for a variety of different purposes. So we'll talk about the ways in which that's changed the designated sick leave approach that we've used historically. Typical patterns of sick leave: there are about 55% of U.S. employers have a designated sick leave currently, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and their 2016 surveys. 4 to 12 days per year is fairly typical. We'll look at some data, by the way, on a number of the studies that have been done in a brief time. The coverage is earned through tenure. So the sick leave coverage can be variable. It can be attached to tenure. It is in many cases, and it can then adjust as the individual, as an incentive for people to remain with their employer. The 7-day national average use of sick leave is what is generally looked at across organizations like Commerce Clearinghouse that have been monitoring the rate and usage of sick leave. So 7 days a year is a fairly typical. That's a little lower than it used to be with the 8 days, but part of that change is due to the increasing shift toward paid time off and bank type systems for sick leave or for annual leave. It can be with or without accrual, so that means that some employers will allow you to accrue unused days and then to receive some payout of that at a time usually associated with retirement. It also can be with or without an incentive payout that is intended to either cause people to use their leave more in a more spread across time basis, rather than leaving it accruing in a sense of fund that allows them to build up the sick leave usage. And those are oftentimes associated with retirement times where people are using up that accrued sick leave as a way of leaving work earlier but continuing to get paid. So it offers some stability related to compensation. Or about 40% of employers currently offer combined leave. Paid time off is what we're calling that. It is also called combined leave systems. There are a number of other acronyms that are used in the human resource field. But paid time off, about 40% of people. And generally it's somewhere between 50 and 90% of previous any cause leave. So we're going to look at some data that basically shows a narrower range, somewhere around 80 to 90% of the combined leave as an amount of the designated types of leave. And there are a variety of different types of leave that are built into the employee policies that govern employers and employees. It's also using, we can use unscheduled leave and some definition of that. Some use a definition of 24 hours where leave is requested within 24 hours of the actual start of the leave, or 48 hours within the start of the leave. And that is oftentimes seen as a proxy for sick leave absenteeism. So if we go to a paid time off system and we still want to look at sick leave as an occurrence in our population, we can sometimes use the unscheduled leave definition as a sick leave absenteeism proxy. So it allows us to look at that. There's obviously value in being able to have scheduled leave where the supervisor and where the other employees can adjust to the absence of the individual from the workplace under a leave arrangement. So these are the typical patterns for the designated sick leave and the combined sick leave or paid time off. Sick leave days per employee, and what I'd like to do is to go through about 7 graphs with you. And this particular one shows data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can go onto their website and actually use the search engine to find a number of recent types of studies that have been done and published. And this was done in March of 2015. It essentially looks at the number of paid sick leave days per workers in private industry. So this does not include state, municipalities, or federal governmental employees. We're going to look at them as in a separate slide. So if we look at all establishments, about 7 days of sick leave is that national kind of average. You can see also that the larger firms or the larger amounts of employees, looking at the light blue, the red, and the kind of yellowish, the larger the employer, the more generous the sick leave. So that's a general rule. In addition, the longer the tenure, the higher the amount of sick leave, dedicated sick leave as well. So this data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics is nationwide, and it shows us a little bit of the patterns that affect the number of sick leave days in a dedicated sick leave approach. And this would account for about 50% of the work sites in the U.S. This next graphic is our access to sick leave benefits. And the access is the percent of the workforce involved. And this again is showing us a comparison, or actually showing us for the first time, a comparison of private industry versus state and local government. And so those are the categories, and we're focused on sick leave. So if you look at the first line, all private industry workers, it shows that about 64%, 65% of employers in the private sector offer a dedicated sick leave arrangement. So that's a higher number than the ones we're quoting, but that's also a context of including all types of employers, which broadens the categories considerably. And then if you go down to the item that shows, and let me see if I can go ahead and use a laser pointer for this. If you see this one, the all private industry workers, and that's about a 65% occurrence rate. If they're all state and local government workers, we suddenly jump up to about 80, almost 90%. So that basically tells us that state and local governmental employers are much more generous in their offerings and provision of paid sick leave. And in addition, private becomes less generous for all the various analytics or areas. So private is less generous for all quartiles. When we start looking at the lowest 25, the next lowest, the highest, and so on, those numbers tend to go up as we move and compare the private to the state and local. So that basically says to us that state and local has a much more significant compensation cost associated with sick leave than the private employer is likely to have. That's a way of being able to interpret this particular graphic. Now, let's move on to the next graphic, which is going to examine another aspect of sick leave versus paid leave for private industry workers. This now shows us the shift from dedicated sick leave to the occurrence, and it looks at the pattern of the average number of paid vacation days and paid sick days provided by length of tenure for full-time private industry workers. And we're looking at two periods of time, the comparison of 1992 and 93 with the 2012. So we are actually looking at a 20-year period. The difference is between the first set and the second set for paid vacation and paid sick leave. And what you see here also is a color bar which indicates the length of tenure. So the 1 year is your new worker. The 5 years of tenure, 10 years of tenure, 20 years of tenure. So the purple indicates the long duration employee. The yellow tends to indicate the new employee. And then we are broken down into paid vacation amounts 20 years apart and paid sick leave 20 years apart. And here we're essentially looking at the following finding. The tenure is diminishing in generosity. So what we're seeing is this drop off in the longer period of time that people are employed, and particularly much more so in the area of sick leave. And much of this, I think, is accounted for by shifts that are occurring in the private sector from designated sick leave to paid time off. And that move to include vacation days we can see building here in the paid vacation, where it's diminishing on the sick leave side. So part of that, I believe, is the change in the structural way that they're looking at paid sick leave days versus vacation days. So there's obviously something going on with that private industry workers and less of an influence. And it may well be connected to their inability to necessarily stop abuse of sick leave benefits, and the shift in younger workers to an entitlement orientation, which says, though these are my benefits, I'm going to use them, therefore I'm going to be absent from work. So that's the context for this particular Bureau of Labor Statistics survey that was conducted in 2015. Now, the movement toward PTO is demonstrated more by this particular graphic, and it just shows you over the period of time from 2002 4 years later, 2006, 4 years later, 2010, and 4 years later, 2014. This survey results, these were examined fairly large sample surveys of employers conducted by World at Work, which used to be the American Journal of Compensation. So this is the people who handle compensation for our employers, both public and private sector settings. This work was done and published in 2015, and what it shows is the very high 2002, 71% of the survey population had a designated traditional system with vacation time, sick leave, personal time, and those, by the way, can also include jury duty. They can have grievance leave where you are grieving a family loss. There may be something to do with adoption. There may be respite care for elders. So there's all kinds of different categorization in traditional leave systems. In the paid time off bank type system, we see a 28% of the survey population, where we then see that increasing by some significant amounts, and now the difference is between these numbers. At the same time, other types of approaches, and the others include, for instance, not having leave systems. So the people have experimented and then are now declining that experimentation, and I believe moving more to this particular approach. So we're seeing more of that paid time off bank type system increasing. My expectation would be that this number in the next 4 years will come down. This number will go up somewhat. And I believe that that also accounts for the shifting demographics in our workforce. Now let's look at average number of PTO days. And this is again the World of Work study. And it looked at the paid time off bank type and the number of days that were in that according to the range of tenure, or the length of employment with an employer. The traditional system, which has the averages combined for all the different numbers. And what you see here is that this particular amounts are usually 10 to 20% lower in terms of the difference between a traditional system of leave and the PTO system. So if you look at the numbers here, they're generally 10 to 20% lower for the PTO bank. And that's done primarily because very few people use all the different kinds of designated leave. So instead of just taking this number of days and all of a sudden saying we're now guaranteeing everyone can have that number of days off, that would lead to a significant reduction in productivity for a workforce. So some employers have taken a more mercenary approach and said, let's take 30% off of these or 40% off of these when we convert to this. And what we may do then is we may structure a higher proportion of increase with tenure rather than having this particular pattern of increased number of days associated with tenure. So if I want to provide a stronger incentive for people to stay and be retained in my employment and be retained as part of my labor force, I may in fact want to bump up the ratios here so that people begin to value being here for a length of time because the number of days that I have access to go up significantly. Now, in a wellness case, we also have the issue of what your carryover strategy is. So if you have to use these days within a set period of time, that's going to actually lead to a little better wellness approach and well-being approach because it avoids people banking and staying at work and not getting the benefit of being away from work for periods of time. This is also related to our connections through electronic devices and communications email, text messaging, and so on. So this particular graphic is just showing us that there's about a 40 to 50% range between the 1 year and the 20 year. So that range is from this number down to this one. So that's another kind of a differentiator for how this is designed and what its impact is on people's sense of retention with a workforce and their satisfaction and their wellness-oriented effects of being away from work. Now, the amount of paid time off, this comes again from the World at Work 2015 study, and it basically looks at traditional PTO systems. It breaks those traditional systems into vacation usage, sick leave usage, and personal usage. And so what it tries to do in this particular portion of the study was to estimate how much people are actually using the various three major categories. And vacation would be with family for extended period of time, usually going out of area. Personal being use of time off to accomplish things in area. So I believe that that was part of how they distinguish the differences here. The sick was actually, did they use the day for a personal illness or a personal set of symptoms or issues. And here we have the amount of paid time off ends up being in the three categories, averaging 19 days across all three of these categories for the person at 1 year of service, the new employee. And then at 20 years of service, we are looking at 34 days, which is about 45% higher than our less than 1 year of service. So the differential based on tenure is approximately 45% from the very high tenure to low tenure. And again, across the vacation, sick, and personal, you see roughly from the data these sets of relationships. Now, the actual use of sick leave days comes from another study recently done by Commerce Clearinghouse, Inc. from the Chicago area. They're a national firm, though. They're located in Chicago. And what they tried to do was to look at what were the real reasons people use sick leave. And if we start with the family issues, we're generally looking at about a quarter of people actually being sick and claiming sick leave use when they have a family-related issue. So that's usually going to be children and or other spouses that are needing attention, needing care. About 45% of the reported sick leave was attributed to personal illness. And just to give you an idea, the National Health Survey has found that the average American worker experiences somewhere in the area of 2 medical symptom events personally per month, which is 24 per year. And part of that time we decide to stay at home. The other part of that time we either ignore it or we just decide to go to work and we lose some productivity, and that's what we call presenteeism. So we have absenteeism, and in the cases where that's done, about half of our days of sick leave in a dedicated sick leave system are usually due to personal illness. Stress-related can be, in a sense, no sickness, but I'm feeling stressed out. This is kind of the mental health day that we have traditionally used when things get intense. Then another 9% are considered to be entitlement, and that's where if I'm going to lose it, I'm going to use it. Or if I'm of an age where I value my time off and I want to do something, I may take sick leave to not dip into my vacation leave. So that's an entitlement use, and about 10% of sick leave day use in a dedicated sick leave system is related to that. About 13% are personal needs, and that's where I'm not ill, but I need to take a day off to go get my license renewed, or I need to go and do something with my family, maybe show up at a special event for a child. So I am putting that in the area of personal needs. So when we talk about the issue about how much of our sick leave is actually real, true sick leave, it's probably about half. And that's the part that's affected by the things, the strategies we're going to look at that wellness oftentimes can program for to reduce sick leave use. Now, currently, about 30 peer-reviewed studies have been published on sick leave reduction from wellness programs, and in general, about a quarter of sick leave is reduced by a wellness program. And because we've got about 7 days of use, we're generally looking at a little over 2 days or so of use related to, or a little under 2 days of sick leave reduction in the context of a traditional designated leave system and a wellness program that's intended to affect that. So we do have a fair amount of peer-reviewed literature that documents that 25% average reduction, which is around 2 days per year, depending on the amount of sick leave in a given population. So that's the context for the issue of the 50% reduction affected by wellness programming, and in a moment we'll look at what are the pathways of how wellness affects that sick leave. Now, first of all, some useful axioms about sick leave, paid sick leave. And as we go through these, I want to just highlight them. First of all, few organizations have good sick leave data for the entire workforce. Because of the exempt, non-exempt populations, we generally don't have sick leave data from our exempt populations, those people that are working in a managerial role primarily. So we don't have good organization-wide sick leave data in most circumstances. Also, women generally use more sick leave than men, and that may be attributable to family-related care, because the female is oftentimes the caregiver for the family, so that she may be affected by what occurs in terms of illness within the family. Age is becoming a less accurate predictor of usage. So part of our problem is that even though the younger person may not have as many morbidity events, illness and injury events, their expectation for use of the benefit and their sense of entitlement may in fact push them to higher use of sick leave. But age is becoming less of an accurate predictor of sick leave usage. In addition, accrual systems tend to create a large unfunded liability. So the good idea that the human resource person has to deal with the abuse of sick leave by creating some accrual systems that allow you to get partial or full credit for the value of sick leave not used, those accrual systems tend to create large unfunded liabilities, which means that we don't put money against it, and then we have somebody who's retiring, and all of a sudden we've got 3 months of salary that are not funded, and we are missing the work of that individual being out because they are using up that accrued sick leave. So that's a downside of our accrual systems. Also, with the accrual systems, we get an incentive for people to not use their sick leave or not be absent, and if they are also doing a similar thing with a vacation, then that's what creates some of the additional stress, pressure, and effects on well-being. In addition, weather tends to affect sick leave usage. So if the weather's bad, I may, on the margin, decide to stay home rather than to come into work. So winter periods of time tend to have higher usage of sick leave. Monday and Friday absence patterns can be significant. And historically, people who are often absent on a Monday or a Friday, sometimes that could be seen as an underlying statement of their abuse of alcohol and or substances. So the idea that if your pattern of sick leave is you're always absent on Monday or Friday, then that raises the issue. It doesn't give you a guaranteed relationship, but what it does do is it sets the stage for you to ask the question, is there some other underlying phenomena going on? Lower the job satisfaction level, the higher the sick leave usage. So if we're not very happy with our work and we're not very satisfied with what we are encountering, or we find it to be a hostile work environment, we're going to use more of our sick leave as a general rule. Most populations are moving to bimodal distribution of use. So you have a portion of your population that uses all of it and a portion of it that uses very little of it. So that's an age and gender and generational set of dynamics that tends to be occurring in the U.S. population. So here, these are some of the more useful axioms about paid sick leave. This is dedicated sick leave. Now, some more useful axioms about paid sick leave are as follows. First of all, the physician note requirements that many organizations have used to try and prevent abuse are generally not a good idea due to their cost impact. So what happens there is for many companies and organizations basically said, we want to control the abuse of sick leave, so if you're out, you better get a note from your physician before you come back in. So that, unfortunately, increases your benefit cost and health benefit cost depending on the type of design of your health insurance. The use it or lose it provision policies can also create artifacts. So if you have a carryover, or at the end of the year you have unused sick leave days and you have to use them within a particular time period, that may be good for your well-being, but it will create the artifact that people will be 3 days sick in December, about the time that you're usually going through some present buying for family members. So there are artifacts that you can observe around use it or lose it types of sick leave policies. If there's no carryover provisions, are probably a good idea in the sense that if you are going to have a paid time off system, you don't want people to not take their time off. So those carryover provisions need to be carefully weighed to give you enough of an incentive for the employee to take time off, but also not to either take it all off or not be operating in a way that they have no cushion for perhaps a health event or something, a family emergency that creates a problem for them. But in general, the no carryover provisions for things like dedicated sick leave, even though they create artifacts, are probably a good idea based on the well-being issues of a workforce and of individuals in a workforce. Short-term disability is probably a more important benefit. It's when I look across the 1,000 or so employers that I've worked with, I would say about 30 to 40% did not have a short-term disability policy. And that I think is a problem because all of us are not immune to having a significant health problem. If we're in an automobile injury or we have a particularly difficult medical problem, we need to be able to have that short-term disability provision. And that's where we also get into the integrated disability, where you're looking at how these disability absence benefits fit together. So that's probably a better thing for us to be doing than even the sick leave issues, is making sure people are financially protected against any kind of short-term disability. In the PTO leave policies, make it harder to measure the economic return of a worksite wellness program, particularly if I want to evaluate the impact of a sick leave reduction from an economic perspective. We're going to go through an example of that in a moment. But paid time off leave policies make it harder to measure the economic return of your wellness program. The PTO does create more incentive for healthy behavior and healthy lifestyles. So if we have combined all our leave and we allow people the freedom to be able to take the leave for things that they value, it does in fact create more incentive for people not to come down with those 24 plus medical symptom events per year on average. So it does create more incentive for better self-care and for better and healthier behavior. And finally, PTO is likely to increase presenteeism losses. So when we have a context where we're not dealing with dedicated sick leave, and I can convert those days that would have been in the sick leave to a paid time off and actually take them as vacation, then I want to conserve my vacation days. So I may in fact choose, instead of staying home, I may choose to go into work, which means that I need to have in my wellness program some help for people that are at work with basic symptoms that are affecting their productivity. So those are some axioms, again, about paid sick leave use. Now, the costs of sick leave absenteeism we want to look at as visible costs, and those costs can include the salary and wage of the person who's absent. That's usually how we cost that. Work not completed, so there may be some additional costs in things that I don't get done. Perhaps my sales activity is not as high, so I can then put some of the effect of my absence into that reduced sales revenue. Compensation of possible replacements. So if I'm in a school district, I have a pretty high replacement rate if I'm a teacher, so and or working in the kitchen. So I may in fact then have the compensation of the replacement to include in the cost of that visible cost of sick leave absenteeism. The hidden costs are going to be overtime for other employees to fill in, so I may not capture that, although it may happen. Decreased overall productivity of affected employees, so I may have the strain caused by my absence as an employee affect my coworkers. Any temporary help costs incurred, so I may in fact have something occurring downstream, but it's because I'm absent. I once worked with a client that was a lumber mill in Alaska, and one of the things that they had is they had such a problem with substance abuse that their workforce was about 25% larger than they needed because of the high amount of absenteeism related to alcohol and substance abuse. So that's a situation where the temporary help or even permanent help is increased in cost because of the pattern of sick leave and missing work. There's also the possible loss of business. So sometimes workers that are in sales positions or in actually working directly with customers and clients may in fact lead to a loss of business. And then possible dissatisfied customers. So if I've lost some customers that are there because some of my key employees are absent, that's a hidden cost. I won't be necessarily calculating it, but it is definitely an economic implication for sick leave. And finally, there may be problems with employee morale. If I have some people that are misusing sick leave, that may create some morale problems with other employees that are affected by their choices in terms of their missing work. So again, these are some of the costs of sick leave absenteeism. We have visible costs and we have hidden costs. And usually we're going to do the visible cost side because we can usually count that and count those. This is harder for us to get a handle on. Now, possible sick leave analytics. What are the major trends affecting paid sick leave costs? And there's some analytics that we can use to help us determine what those trends are. We can look at the average days of sick leave per full-time equivalent employee per year for for the last 5 years. We can look at the average days of sick leave per full-time employee per year by major geographic location. So if we have multiple locations, we can look at comparisons. We can look at the proportion of sick leave by major etiological cause, and that sometimes can be picked up in a survey or an HRA, and it can help us understand what reasons, and it kind of goes back to the Commerce Clearinghouse way in which they were able to look at the cause of sick leave use, and it's usually from some sort of survey document completion. The average incidence of sick leave by the day of the week involved, that's the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or weekends. Average days of sick leave accrued per full-time employee for the last 5 years. So we're watching what's happening with the accrual process. Percent of eligible employees by the number of sick leave days taken each year. So looking at the cohorts of people by their sick leave behavior. Percent of eligible employees by the number of sick leave days accrued each year. So that's again a categorization based on the number of days. And these all go back to major trends and understanding trends in sick leave. What paid sick leave metrics should be routinely tracked? Our suggestion is you look at the average number of sick leave days per full-time equivalent per year, and that's in a designated sick leave situation. The average number of unscheduled leave days, and that's defined either in a 24-hour period or 48-hour period before the actual taking of the leave, per full-time equivalent per year. So that's giving you a look at the actual sick leave proxy. And then the average salary and wage costs per day of work per year. So these are oftentimes the general metrics that are going to help us understand the nature and the economics of sick leave for the organizations that we're working with. Now, the estimation of the value of sick leave savings can be done, but usually we want to know, is there a designated approach to sick leave or a combined? And if we have combined, we might use the unscheduled leave category to actually carry out the analysis. There's the visible versus hidden costs. So we want to know how extensive are we going to look at the underlying economic costs. Is there a reduction or an increase? Is the trend line around the use of sick leave, is it going down? Is it staying the same or getting higher? And what's our replacement rate? So there are certain positions where we essentially have to have a replacement. So in school districts, it's very high for teachers. So those replacement rates tend to pump up and push up the economic cost associated with sick leave. Time period involved, so we have the issues around when that sick leave is occurring and are there any seasonal variations that we need to factor in. The validity of the numbers we're getting. All numbers are suspect. There are always going to be some reporting errors or some perception around what should be reported. And ceteris paribus is, from an economic point of view, all things being equal. So that's the idea that we can carry out analysis from one year to the next with situations that are fairly similar. And the econometric assumptions basically mean what are the assumptions we're making to carry out the analysis of the sick leave and its savings. So though that's what we want to do is to make those explicit, to make them clear so that we know how we got the numbers we got, and we also can explain it to the people that we are presenting the data to. Now, in addition, we usually want to have actual wage or salary cost and versus averages. So if we are talking about a set number of people who are participants in a wellness program, we could use their actual wage and or salary costs in our analysis. Or we can simply use averages for the entire population. So that would be a question mark around methodology. And if we're using averages, we need the number of usual annual workdays for the entire organization and the total annual salary and wage cost for the workforce. Then divide it one into the other. That gives us an amount per day. And we're going to look at an actual example of that in a moment. You can also, are you going to use the HRA related question? And the HRA question is usually something like, within the last 12-month period or last calendar year, how many sick leave days did you use for a personal illness or injury? You know, it's that kind of question, and using a consistent question over time to, in fact, track the sick leave use. And are you going to use discounting or use of constant dollars? Is there going to be that level of econometric or economic analysis? So the issue of use of discounting. Now the example of estimating sick leave savings that we're going to look at is in this case. We've got 1,000 employees, 500 of them take part in the wellness program. Their average annual salary for all the employees is $50,000. Assume 200 days a year of work on average. So that's the accumulation of all the days of work once you've taken out all the different kinds of leave, if you've got a traditional leave system, or you've taken out the PTO days in terms of the numbers of days of absence that people would assume or have. And then assume an average of 2.6 days of sick leave reduction per program participant per year. And that might be derived from an HRA, where you're asking people to report as participants what specific change has taken place in the number of days of personal sick leave use. So this is the assumption we're making for this particular analysis. And then assume the effect is consistent across the population. So that's one of the assumptions we need to be able to do in terms of carrying out any kind of economic analysis. We also assume our wellness program cost at $200 per employee per year. So that gives us, in a sense, the direct cost of the program. Now, the calculations that you would go through to get an estimate of what the sick leave savings is for this particular organization is you would take the $50,000 annual salary, divide it by the 200 days, which gives you $250 a day as the average wage amount. That $250 times 2.6 is $650 per wellness program participant per year. So that's how I've then translated the cost per day times the number of days per individual that's reduced. That takes us down to this. And then the 650 times 500 is the assumption of consistent effect across the population. I'm now extrapolating that across all the people that are participants. That gives me a $325,000 economic return or savings for the year that I'm studying. And then the total program cost is going to be 1,000 people times 200, or $200,000 per year. So the benefit cost ratio would be the $325,000 economic savings divided by the cost of the program, which gives me a 1.62 to 1 benefit to cost ratio. And that ROI is then 162%. So this is only looking at the sick leave effects, sick leave reduction and savings, and then comparing it to the direct cost of my wellness program. But this gives you an example of how you would do an estimation of the sick leave savings associated with a wellness program. Now, how wellness programming affects sick leave absenteeism. And there are a number of ways that this happens. One is through risk reduction. So we know from the epidemiologic literature contributed by people like D. Eddington and David Anderson and Ron Getzel and Seth Serksner and others that specific risk factors have impact on sick leave absenteeism. So as we reduce the prevalence and severity of risk in the population, specific risk, it has a potential effect of reducing the sick leave absenteeism. It also can lessen the morbidity. So we may in fact see that there's fewer upper respiratory infections or fewer events that create a work absence. So it lessens the illness and injury in a given situation. So we've got risk reduction effects, We've got then also independent. They can be independent or they can be dependent on that risk reduction, changes in the morbidity in our population. We also have increases in medical self-care skills. So we may in fact have people actually making better decisions about when to be absent versus not be absent, and what to do in terms of home treatment about the condition. So that's going to potentially affect my decisions around sick leave absenteeism. There's also some issues around improving my consumer health skills. So I may in fact know how to and learn how to be more skilled at handling a particular reoccurring medical problem, and how to handle that by getting early attention or getting an antibiotic treatment regime set up, or something that allows me to have better consumer skills when I am in fact using the healthcare system. We also can have improved self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is also called self-agency, and it's the work of Albert Bandura and others that have essentially shown us that depending on how much confidence I have in my decisions around my health will affect my choice of what I do, whether I go in, whether I don't go in, whether I seek medical attention, whether I take anything to remove or reduce the symptom effects. We also then have some improved symptom relief that might occur when I can, for instance, take, if I have an upper respiratory infection and I decide to take a particular decongestant, that may in fact make me feel good enough to go in rather than to be absent. So if I have some actions that I'm taking where I've learned to handle those symptoms in a little bit more effective way, then I can reduce the sick leave absenteeism. And finally, the reduced entitlement. So if I've moved from a designated sick leave system to a PTO system, I in fact expect to have people have less entitlement, and they may in fact do more to take better care of their health and actually be absent less. So those are some of the ways that a wellness program affects underlying sick leave absenteeism in a working population. Now, summary of key points. The average number of sick leave days used per year per employee in the U.S. is 7. Now that's come down about a whole day over the last 5 years. Paid sick leave is a general expectation for most employees. So most employees expect somehow to be able to have a sick leave day that doesn't cause them to lose a wage or salary. Most employers have a dedicated form of paid sick leave policies. And we saw from one of the surveys, the BLS survey, that about 50% of employers in the U.S. have a dedicated sick leave. 41% had the paid time off system. However, more organizations are moving to a PTO approach. So I believe that you will see more of a movement toward the PTO approach. PTO leave is increasing in popularity across the U.S. workforce. And the conversion to PTO changes the calculation of economic return of worksite wellness programs. So I have to focus, for instance, on unscheduled leave and examine that if I wanted to try to get an idea of what that effect was. And then I'm having some different kinds of calculations because I'm then dealing with the issue of unscheduled versus scheduled leave, and is there an economic difference between them. However, PTO aligns better with wellness than most designated leave approaches, but can reduce the economic return of wellness efforts, particularly because sick leave is the second most frequently examined economic variable when people have looked at the economic return of worksite wellness programs. According to the National Health Survey, the typical American worker experiences an average of 2 personal medical symptom events a month. So we have a fairly significant amount of kind of morbidity or potential morbidity occurring in working populations. A set of standard paid sick leave metrics should be routinely collected. So we're basically using and advocating that you keep the track of those analytics to help you know more about what's happening related to sick leave. And finally, wellness programs can specifically target interventions on sick leave reduction. So that's a opportunity that we have to target our specific behaviors and the issues that are driving sick leave as we then set up interventions and have those interventions address those specific targets. Now, let's answer some key questions. Our first question is, if we keep hearing about integrated absence management, what exactly is that? Well, you also can hear about integrated disability management. So those are two kinds of things. They're pretty much the same, but they basically deal with the integration of our absence benefits and aligning the incentives for conservation so that people actually have some common incentives for them to stay at work when it's appropriate for them to do so. Also, if we've got interventions that help reduce productivity loss from an underlying health problem when they do choose to stay at work, we then are also contributing to increased productivity. And there is a CE module on integrated disability management that you can look more deeply into what this actually involves. So it is looking at how to align the absence-related benefits that an employer provides and also align the employee incentives around the use and work activity. A second question is the question of, we have very poor collection of sick leave data. That's not too atypical. What else can we do to get better data? One alternative I've found and used is to use a health risk assessment or well-being assessment with a large percentage of the population, and then to use a standard question related to sick leave absenteeism. And it usually reads something like this: within the last year period or last calendar year, how many days of sick leave for a personal health problem did you experience or did you take? So you can kind of structure the question in a way that you can repeat it in the same way year after year and use it to develop what's called a time series kind of approach to sick leave absenteeism trends and patterns. You can also shorten the recall period if you feel like that's an important methodological issue, but just be careful that you are aware that there are seasonal differences in sick leave use. So we have things like winter, we have vacations, we have the issues around the holidays of various types. So there's a variety of issues that are going to interfere with sick leave data. So if you do shorten the recall period, then you need to be careful about what period of time and its consistency in terms of year-over-year comparison use. The third question that we might ask is, how should PTO programs affect our positioning of worksite wellness efforts? And I think that it should be used to strengthen our wellness programs. And the idea is that we want to help employees get the full value of their paid time off. So if we can use the wellness program to help you better utilize and more fully utilize the days, the paid days that you have, then that's a good way of structuring our wellness programs. And you can also introduce the presenteeism aids and helps to help people choose when they choose to stay at work with an underlying health problem. And you do want to measure all 5 economic variables: health plan costs, sick leave absenteeism, workers' compensation, incidence and severity and costs, and disability insurance costs, which include short-term disability, long-term disability, and the issues around presenteeism and the use of loss of productivity associated with underlying health problems when I choose to stay at work. So these are some of the answers to some key questions. Now that you've completed the module, go ahead and take the quiz.